Paradoxes are annoying. There's no doubt about it. Why am I talking about paradoxes? Well, having now been looking into this whole flat earth issue for a good 7-8 months or so by now, I think if I'm honest with myself and honest with whoever might be watching various videos I put out and looking into these things, I think most of us who have been engaged in this whole area of investigation and speculation and scriptural research and the whole nine yards, I think if we're honest about it, we have to admit that there are at least a number of things that we're still, at this point, struggling to put together. And there's still a significant number of issues and questions which, at the current time, definitely just feel like paradoxes, especially when you get into the whole map question. And I've been recently wrestling with a few myself, to be completely honest. Just in this last week or so, I was coming across the whole issue of the equinox, since we just went through the spring equinox, and of course the people who are out to debunk the flat earth idea altogether are pointing to it as undeniable proof that we live on a globe, and this is the only way that the sun could rise at apparent due east from every point along the surface of the earth, and how you could have 12 hours of daylight at every point of the earth. And I fully understand how this is claimed to operate based on the globe model, with the earth being exactly between each of the solstice points on its alleged solar orbit and all that. And to me, this is a significant puzzle. It's a significant challenge. Similarly, I was just watching yesterday a video that Rob Skiba put out talking about the infamous flight from Chile to Australia that dips down and almost even touches Antarctica. He did this big lengthy piece looking at the Gleason's map and sort of examining this idea of the various quadrants on an azimuthal equidistant map, representing the same distances between each of the lines of longitude, both in the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. And it's an interesting exploration of the topic, but from where I stand, it really does also start to have some serious problems with it as well, particularly if you take that premise and try and apply it to the more northerly latitudes. The closer you get to the North Pole, which our conventional flat Earth maps put at the center and allege that the sun and the stars are all rotating around. Obviously this is going to be a problem because just by definition, those distances are going to have to get smaller and smaller as you approach that singular point where they all converge. And so the bottom line is that, yeah, we still have a number of things that just don't seem to make sense. They don't seem to line up. And really, this isn't anything new. I mean, even from the beginning of looking into the whole flat earth topic in general, when I was first taking a fresh look at the Bible and comparing all these ideas, you're presented with the sort of obvious seeming contradictions of a circular dome-enclosed flat earth model, but then somehow you have the existence of the four corners and the four pillars, and then of course, and there's ideas of that those four corners are actually outside the dome, or I've put out a video exploring the idea of the four cardinal directions, where north, south, east, and west are in fact fixed directional points, which Enoch itself actually seems to describe far more than north being a point in the center, which everything revolves around, and south being just sort of an infinite ring around the whole thing. So there's all these really interesting ideas that somehow we keep coming back to again and again, but honestly we still are struggling to put a lot of these pieces together in a way that makes sense from our current perspective, our current point of understanding. So yeah, in a lot of ways it feels like you're just sitting in the middle of a big paradox, because at the same time, as I've been looking into this stuff now intently for months, when I came into it, I was already convinced that the Apollo moon landings were a hoax, and that was, I already had that under my belt, so to speak. But But then as you start to look at everything that NASA and all the other space agencies have put out since their inception, so I've never been more convinced that nobody's ever been to space, or that even space, that we have sufficient evidence to believe that space exists. And I've been looking into all these historical progressions of heliocentrism and Copernicanism and the Copernican principle and all these things, and so many of the pieces just fit together so perfectly. It just continues to point you in this direction, that it was all a necessary component of not just evolutionary cosmology, but a necessary foundation for the whole idea of the whole ancient aliens idea and alien deception and the UFO meme and on and on and on. But then, of course, the critics always bring you back to this point of what's the real model? What are we on? How does it work? Explain the stars. Explain this. Explain that. Everyone wants to see the model. Like Tiger Dan was saying, if you don't have a map, you don't have an argument. You don't have proof. And that's always the big push. We're always being pushed to solve it, to figure it out, and to if you can't answer all these seemingly contradictory and paradoxical questions, because like I said, not just I've never been more convinced that everything about space I've never been more convinced that everything we've been shown about space is fabricated and it's just an all-out hoax. And at the same time, when we look at all these curvature experiments, we don't find evidence of curvature. So if there's no curve, you have a plane. It's pretty simple. So, but then, then everyone's trying to solve all these questions, like the question of 24-hour daylight in Antarctica, and solve the southern pole stars, and solve all these, predominantly celestial questions, trying to understand what the heavens are and how it all works. And typically we're trying to do this, again, we're still adhering to the Copernican principle, even though we don't even, I think, consciously recognize we are, in terms of explaining it all in terms of physical, materialistic forces and mechanics, when I think since the beginning I've kind of really been forcing myself to re-examine those kinds of assumptions, and especially from a biblical point of view. We look at all the connections between the angels and the stars and the heavens, and you're thinking of these things now of a heavenly realm or of dimensional capacities that we maybe don't even have the lexicon to describe, or the dimensional models to really even try and put it together. I think the more you get in, it starts to break down, because you're not just dealing with a purely three-dimensional time-space framework. So what are we on? So what do we do? Where do we go? I mean, you can have a meltdown and start calling everyone a liar, or you can just quietly kind of slip away and just get frustrated with it. And that's something that I think I've seen a lot of people do, even if they haven't openly said a word about it. There's just been a number of people who were coming around, 6 months ago, 3 months ago, and suddenly I'm not seeing them and I'm not hearing from them, and it makes me wonder. And I think this is a much more common thing, is that people just, I think, get burned out on it and get frustrated, and they start hitting these roadblocks and these paradoxes, and either they conclude quietly that, well, maybe we really are just on a globe and we're in space and the whole thing must be crazy, and I feel silly for even looking into it. Or they're just not sure and they don't know what to think and kind of just need to get on with life and not obsess about it. And I can fully appreciate that feeling. But it's the kind of thing where once you've seen enough to where it's, I don't know about other people, but I'm the kind of person to where once I've seen too much to just walk away completely, to just not know that they're lying a great deal about the cosmology and the earth and the stars and the nature of the earth. And we know what the Bible says. We know what the Book of Enoch says. And we know that they are vastly different. We know that the space race, these space programs, are a unified hoax, which I know is just so difficult for many people to wrap their heads around. For me, that's one of the easier pieces. It always has been. But I think, like a lot of us, where we get hung up on is, how does it work? How do we explain it? How do we make the model? How do we build the model? And we keep coming back to these types of paradoxes. And I myself even lately started wondering, and recently I just keep almost coming to the place of wondering, what fundamental assumption are we still making? What piece of the puzzle are we still missing? What are we still injecting into this whole thing that really we should go back and reconsider? And I don't know if it is this idea of the North Pole being at the center. A lot of people wonder about, well, what if Jerusalem was the center? And that was something I've wondered about since the beginning. But then it's like hard to reconcile that concept with the idea of either one or two poles. Like there's a magnetic pole, we know that. Why shouldn't that logically be the center? And Polaris, the North Star, being above the North Pole, and shouldn't that mean that that's the center? And again, I think you start driving yourself crazy, going like there's something about all these maps that are wrong, but then part of me wonders, are they all wrong but all right in a way? Are they all projections of something that we haven't even considered yet? And it just starts to sound kind of, I think, a different level of crazy. But something too that stuck out to me from almost the very beginning, when you're on the one hand looking at all these pieces of possible flat earth concepts that have to do with circles, whether it's the circular earth under a dome, and then the circuits of the luminaries going around a central point. And so you have all these circular aspects, and then you also have these square aspects of four pillars, of pillars and four corners, and the four winds. And so it's always like it's this whole sort of underlying paradox of the circular aspects versus the square aspects, right? And interestingly enough, that's one of the central little esoteric riddles embedded within Freemasonry, even in their logo themselves, which of course we can look at and see is of course an adaptation of the six-pointed star, but the way they render it is with a square and a compass. And obviously, a compass is used to draw a circle, and a square is used to draw squares. So even in their logo, their main logo that they stick on everything, is embedded symbolism for the whole occult riddle of squaring the circle. And this is something that, to me, it would make a lot of sense if this whole issue of squaring the circle revolves around this esoteric symbolism has something to do with solving these types of cosmological paradoxes. But anyhow, my point in even bringing all that up is not to even remotely suggest that that's the kinds of things that we need to start looking into ourselves. But even if we're embracing a zetetic ideology or approach to science, but at the same time, I think it has to be tempered with, at the end of the day, remembering that we are finite, that we are even fallen even, and that until we are resurrected and redeemed and see as it really is, there's going to be paradoxes. And are you going to be okay with that? Can you live with that? And see, when you contrast that with science, or with what, as we look at it as scientism, this religion of science turned into this humanistic endeavor, which that basically rejects that. It rejects the idea that there's nothing that we can't ever someday figure out, that we can't ever know, that we can't ever solve, that we can't ever master and comprehend and put into an equation. And that's why I think scientism, materialistic scientism, inevitably, over time, even over generations, but inevitably pushes people into metaphysical, mystical, occult arenas, because it has to. And I don't know, at the end of the day, I guess right now I'm just thinking about the verse that says, to paraphrase, right now we know in part, we see in part, and we know in part, but